I'm sitting in this empty apartment now, and I can hear my own voice echo off the bare walls when I talk to myself. The moving boxes are gone, the furniture is gone, and even the family photos that used to line the hallway are gone. Trevor took everything when he left, including our 2 children, and honestly, I still can't believe how fast it all fell apart. People keep asking me how I let it get this far, and I keep telling them the same thing. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to find some happiness in a marriage that had gone cold, trying to feel appreciated by someone who actually saw me as more than just a wife and mother. But somehow, my attempt to fix what was broken in my life ended up breaking everything else instead. The hotel receipt was what started it all unraveling, though I realize now that Trevor had been watching and waiting for months before that morning. I thought I was being careful, thought I had everything under control, but it turns out my husband is much more observant than I gave him credit for. When he found that receipt in my purse and asked me about the work conference that never existed, I knew I was in trouble, but I had no idea how deep the hole I'd dug really was. Looking back, I can see all the moments where I could have stopped, could have chosen differently, could have saved my family, but at the time, each lie felt necessary, each deception felt justified, and each manipulation felt like self-defense. I kept telling myself that I deserved better than what I had, that I was just taking care of my own needs for once, that everyone else was being unreasonable. Now I understand that while I thought I was choosing freedom, Trevor was choosing his escape route, and he'd been planning it much longer than I'd been planning mine. When Trevor found that receipt, I was standing at the stove making scrambled eggs for the kids, and I remember thinking how normal everything felt in that moment before my world started crashing down. He walked into the kitchen holding this little piece of paper between his fingers, like it was evidence in a murder trial. And when he asked me what the Grandview Hotel charge was for, I didn't even hesitate before telling him it was for the regional conference last weekend. The lie came out so smoothly that I almost believed it myself, but then I saw his face change in a way I'd never seen before. He told me he'd already called the hotel and confirmed there was no conference that weekend, and that's when I realized he hadn't just stumbled across the receipt by accident. He'd been going through my things, probably for weeks, looking for exactly this kind of proof. I tried to turn it around on him, asking him why he was invading my privacy and going through my personal belongings like some kind of detective. I told him his paranoia was becoming unhealthy and that maybe he should be more concerned about why our marriage was struggling than about tracking my every movement. Ruby was sitting at the kitchen table working on her cereal, and I could see her watching us with those big worried eyes that broke my heart. Trevor just stood there, listening to me explain how hurt I was by his lack of trust, and then he walked over to his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder that looked thick enough to contain a novel. He spread out printed emails, bank statements, and what looked like a timeline written in his careful handwriting, and told me he'd been documenting inconsistencies in my stories for 3 months. I felt my stomach drop when I saw how organized everything was, how methodical he'd been about building his case against me. There were dates and times when I'd said I was working late, but my car wasn't in the hotel parking lot, phone records showing calls to numbers he didn't recognize, and credit card charges that didn't match the explanations I'd given him. Ruby asked why Daddy looked so sad, and Oliver started crying because he could feel the tension, even though he was too young to understand what was happening. I told Trevor we needed to discuss this privately, but he said we'd already had plenty of private discussions where I'd lied to his face, and maybe it was time for some honesty in our house. He pulled out a folder thick with printed emails and said he'd been building a case against me like I was some criminal. I couldn't stay in that house with Trevor's evidence spread across the kitchen table like some kind of prosecution exhibit, so I called in sick to work and drove straight to Victoria's apartment. My sister had always been my safe haven when things got complicated, and I needed someone who would understand that marriages aren't simple and that sometimes people make mistakes when they're feeling neglected and unappreciated. Victoria made coffee and listened while I explained how Trevor had been spying on me, going through my personal things, and creating this whole conspiracy theory about my whereabouts. I told her about the hotel receipt and how he'd twisted an innocent explanation into some kind of smoking gun, making it sound like I was running some elaborate scheme, when really I'd just gotten confused about dates and locations. She kept asking specific questions that made me uncomfortable, like why I would have been at the Grandview Hotel, if not for work, and whether I'd been having problems with Trevor that I hadn't mentioned before. I could see her trying to piece together a timeline in her head, the same way Trevor had been doing, and it frustrated me that even my own sister was starting to doubt my version of events. I decided to tell her about Sebastian, but carefully, focusing on how he'd been helping me feel better about myself during a difficult period in my marriage. I explained that Trevor had become distant and critical, always working late or spending time on his hobbies, never really seeing me as anything more than the person who handled the household responsibilities. Sebastian was different. He listened when I talked, complimented me, made me feel like I was still attractive and interesting. Victoria's expression changed when I mentioned his name, and she asked directly if Trevor knew about my friendship with Sebastian. I told her that Trevor wouldn't understand because he'd become jealous and controlling, turning innocent conversations with a friend into something suspicious and threatening. I said that Sebastian had helped me realize how much I'd been settling for in my marriage, how I deserved someone who actually appreciated everything I did. The more I talked, the more I could see Victoria pulling back from me, asking questions like whether I thought it was appropriate to be confiding in another man about my marriage problems, and whether I'd considered how my behavior might look from Trevor's perspective. She reminded me about our children and how they needed stability, not parents who were keeping secrets and creating drama. I tried to explain that I wasn't creating drama. I was just trying to survive in a relationship where I felt invisible and taken for granted. I told her that Sebastian made me feel valued in ways that Trevor hadn't for years, and that maybe if Trevor had been a better husband, I wouldn't have needed to find emotional support elsewhere. Victoria asked if I was having an affair, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice even before I answered. I told her it wasn't that simple, that what Sebastian and I had was more complicated than just physical attraction, that it was about connection and understanding and feeling appreciated for who I really was. Victoria's face changed when I mentioned Sebastian's name, and she asked if Trevor knew about my new friend. After my conversation with Victoria left me feeling more isolated than supported, I threw myself into my fitness routine at FitCore Gym, telling myself that at least there I could focus on improving myself and spending time with someone who actually made me feel good about my choices. Sebastian had been encouraging me to prioritize my own health and happiness, pointing out that I'd spent years putting everyone else's needs before my own. The gym became my escape from the growing tension at home, where Trevor had started treating me like a suspect in some crime he was still investigating. He'd ask casual questions about my day that felt like interrogations, and I could see him watching me when I checked my phone or mentioned plans with friends. Sebastian helped me see that this kind of surveillance was actually a form of emotional abuse, and that I had every right to maintain some privacy and independence. Sunday dinner at Margaret's house had always been a family tradition, but lately these gatherings felt more like hostile territory where I had to defend every decision I made. Margaret had started making comments about how much time I was spending at the gym, asking questions about my new fitness obsession, and whether I thought it was healthy to be away from home so much. I explained that I was finally taking care of myself, after years of putting everyone else first, and that maybe if my family had been more supportive of my personal growth, I wouldn't need to seek that encouragement elsewhere. Margaret gave me one of her looks, and mentioned that she'd noticed how much happier I seemed lately, but in a way that made it sound like an accusation rather than a compliment. Trevor sat through these conversations like he was taking mental notes, and I could see him filing away every detail for his growing collection of evidence against me. The children seemed to sense the undercurrents of tension, with Ruby becoming more clingy and asking repeatedly if everything was okay, while Oliver started having trouble sleeping and would wander into our bedroom at night looking for reassurance. tried to maintain normal family routines, but everything felt strained and artificial, like we were all playing roles in a performance that nobody believed anymore. Sebastian had been telling me that this kind of toxic family dynamic wasn't healthy for anyone, especially the children, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is acknowledge when a situation isn't working. Margaret made another comment about seeing my car at fit call during hours when I'd supposedly been working extra shifts at the hotel, and I could feel my carefully constructed explanation starting to crumble. I told her she must have been mistaken about the timing, or maybe she'd seen a similar car, but I could see both her and Trevor exchanging glances that made my stomach twist. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I spent the rest of the evening feeling like I was walking on thin ice, knowing that one wrong step would send me plunging into water that was much deeper and colder than I'd realized. Sebastian had been right about needing to make some difficult decisions about my future, but I was starting to understand that my family had been making their own decisions about me. When Margaret said she'd driven by Fitcore Tuesday afternoon, I felt my stomach drop because I'd told Trevor I was covering extra shifts. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came on a Thursday evening when Trevor asked me to sit down in the living room after we'd put the children to bed. He had that same manila folder with him, but this time it was even thicker, and he'd organized everything with colored tabs like he was preparing for a business presentation about the dissolution of our marriage. He started by laying out a timeline that showed discrepancies between what I'd told him about my whereabouts and what his investigation had revealed. There were credit card statements showing charges at restaurants during times I'd claimed to be working, phone records highlighting frequent calls to Sebastian's number, and even testimony from Margaret about seeing my car at locations that didn't match my explanations. I tried to turn the focus back to his behavior, asking him how he could justify this level of surveillance and questioning whether he understood how his paranoia was destroying our relationship. I told him that his obsessive need to control and monitor me had created the very problems he was now complaining about, and that maybe if he'd been more trusting and supportive, we wouldn't be in this situation. Trevor listened to my explanations with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was watching a performance he'd already seen too many times. He told me he'd spoken to Sebastian's ex-girlfriend, who'd warned him about Sebastian's pattern of pursuing married women and then disappearing when situations became complicated. She'd described exactly the kind of manipulation tactics that Sebastian had been using with me, though at the time they'd felt like genuine care and attention. The revelation that Trevor had been conducting his own investigation into Sebastian's background made me realize how far behind I was in this game I thought I'd been winning. While I'd been focused on maintaining my version of events, Trevor had been building a comprehensive case that included witnesses, documentation, and even character references that painted a very different picture of my new relationship. I accused him of stalking both me and Sebastian, pointing out that his behavior was becoming increasingly unhealthy and obsessive. I told him that his inability to trust me was probably what had driven me to seek emotional support elsewhere in the first place, and that if he'd been a better husband, I wouldn't have needed to find someone who actually listened to me and made me feel appreciated. The argument escalated until we were both raising our voices, and suddenly, Ruby appeared at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, crying and asking why we were fighting so loudly. The sight of our daughter's scared face in that moment made me realize how much damage we'd already done to our children, but even then, I found myself blaming Trevor for creating this confrontational atmosphere instead of handling things more privately. Trevor picked up Ruby and carried her back to bed, and when he returned to the living room, his demeanor had changed completely. He told me he'd already consulted with a divorce attorney and knew exactly how my affair would impact custody arrangements and financial settlements. The casual way he delivered this information made me understand that while I'd been thinking about day-to-day management of my secrets, he'd been planning for our long-term future. He said he'd already consulted a lawyer and knew exactly what my affair would cost me in a divorce. Sunday dinner at Margaret's house became the setting for what felt like a family intervention, though I didn't realize how coordinated their approach had been until I was sitting at that familiar dining room table, facing a united front of people I'd counted on for support. Margaret had prepared my favorite meal, which should have been a comforting gesture, but instead it felt like a last supper before an execution. Victoria arrived with Nathan, and I could tell immediately from their expressions that they'd been discussing my situation in detail. The conversation started normally enough, with updates about work and the children's school activities, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension building as everyone exchanged meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Margaret began by expressing concern about how stressed I'd seemed lately and how she'd noticed changes in my behavior that worried her as someone who cared about my well-being. She mentioned my frequent absences from family gatherings, my preoccupation with my phone during conversations, and what she described as a general sense that I wasn't fully present even when I was physically there. I tried to explain that I'd been going through a difficult period in my marriage and was working on improving myself through fitness and self-care. But Victoria interrupted to ask directly whether I thought my approach to solving marital problems was helping or hurting my family. The question felt like an ambush, especially coming from my own sister, who I'd trusted with my confidences. Nathan, who usually stayed out of family drama, spoke up to say that he'd been watching Trevor struggle with obvious pain and confusion, and that whatever was happening in our marriage was affecting not just us, but everyone who cared about our family. He pointed out that Ruby had been asking Victoria questions about why her parents seemed angry all the time, and that even a 5-year-old like Oliver could sense the instability in our household. I defended myself by explaining that marriages go through difficult phases, and that I was trying to work through my feelings in the healthiest way possible, rather than just accepting a situation that made me unhappy. I told them that Sebastian had helped me realize I'd been settling for less than I deserved, and that maybe if my family had been more supportive of my personal growth, I wouldn't have needed to find that encouragement elsewhere. The mention of Sebastian's name created an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere, and I realized that they knew much more about my relationship with him than I'd revealed. Margaret asked me directly if I understood what I was risking by pursuing a friendship that was clearly more than platonic, and whether I'd considered the impact on my children of potentially breaking up their family. Victoria took the children to another room to watch television, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes as she gathered Ruby and Oliver, and I knew I was losing her support along with everyone else's. Margaret continued the conversation by describing an incident where she'd seen me with Sebastian at a restaurant downtown, and how their interaction had looked nothing like a casual friendship between a married woman and her fitness trainer. She described watching me kiss Sebastian in the parking lot after what appeared to be an intimate dinner, and the way she delivered this information made it clear that she'd been hoping I would deny it or provide some innocent explanation. Instead, I found myself getting defensive and angry, asking her why she'd been spying on me and whether she thought it was appropriate to follow me around town like some kind of private investigator. Nathan called me selfish for prioritizing my own desires over the stability and well-being of my children, and for putting my entire family through this emotional turmoil because I'd decided I wasn't getting enough attention at home. His bluntness shocked me, but I could see that everyone else in the room agreed with his assessment, even if they weren't willing to state it as directly. I tried to salvage the situation by explaining that everyone was misunderstanding my motivations, and that I'd never intended to hurt anyone, but Margaret cut me off to say that intentions didn't matter when the results were causing this much damage to people she loved. The realization that I was no longer included in that category of people she loved hit me harder than any of the specific accusations they'd made. When Margaret described seeing me kiss Sebastian in the parking lot, I realized my entire family had been watching me destroy everything. The silence in our house after Trevor took the children to Margaret's for what he called a temporary arrangement felt different from any quiet I'd ever experienced before. It wasn't the peaceful calm of a weekend morning or the restful hush of bedtime. It was the hollow emptiness of a place where life used to happen, but doesn't anymore. I walked through rooms that still contained my furniture, but no longer felt like my home, touching surfaces that seemed unfamiliar, despite being surrounded by my own belongings. Trevor had been methodical about removing traces of our family life, together, taking not just clothes and toys, but also photographs from walls and surfaces, leaving behind rectangular outlines in the dust where our memories used to be displayed. He'd even taken the small frame picture of our wedding day that used to sit on my nightstand, though I suppose that made sense given how thoroughly I destroyed what that image represented. I called Sebastian expecting comfort and support, needing to hear from someone who understood why I'd made the choices that had led to this isolation. But his response caught me completely off guard. He told me he'd been thinking about our situation and had decided it would be better for both of us if we took a break from seeing each other while I sorted out my family problems. The way he phrased it made it sound like a temporary pause, but something in his tone suggested this was actually a permanent goodbye. He explained that he'd been offered a position at a FitCore location across town and thought it would be wise to accept the transfer, giving us both some space to figure out what we really wanted from our lives. The timing of this opportunity seemed suspiciously convenient, and I realized that Sebastian had probably been planning his own exit strategy while I'd been fantasizing about our future together. When I pressed him about the promises he'd made regarding supporting me through this difficult transition, he became vague and distant, saying that he'd never meant to complicate my life and that maybe I'd misunderstood the nature of our relationship. The man who'd been telling me I deserved better than my marriage was now suggesting that what I deserved was to work things out with my husband for the sake of my children. I spent the afternoon trying to reach Victoria, but her calls went straight to voicemail, and when I drove to her apartment, she answered the door, but didn't invite me inside. She told me she needed time to process everything that had happened at Margaret's house, and that she wasn't sure how to maintain our relationship while I was making choices that went against everything she believed about family and commitment. The realization that I'd lost my sister's support along with everyone else's made me understand how completely I'd isolated myself through my actions. Every person I'd counted on for emotional backup had stepped away, leaving me to face the consequences of my decisions without the safety net I'd always assumed would be there. I tried to call my workplace to request additional shifts, thinking that staying busy might help me avoid confronting the magnitude of what I'd lost. But when I checked our joint bank accounts online, I discovered that Trevor had already removed my access to most of our shared financial resources. He'd left enough money in one account to cover immediate expenses, but the message was clear. My financial security was no longer guaranteed. The house phone rang once during the evening, and I rushed to answer it, hoping it might be Trevor calling about the children, but it was a representative from our credit card company asking about suspicious charges. I realized that Trevor had been systematically closing accounts and removing my authorization, preparing for a financial separation that would leave me with limited resources and maximum vulnerability. As darkness fell, and I sat alone in what used to be our family room, I began to understand that while I'd been focused on managing the immediate crisis of being discovered, Trevor had been orchestrating a comprehensive plan to extract himself and our children from the wreckage I'd created. Every conversation, every confrontation, every piece of evidence he'd gathered had been leading to this moment where I would find myself completely alone with the consequences of my choices. I sat in our empty house and finally understood that while I thought I was choosing freedom, Trevor had been choosing his escape route all along. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.